The station smelled of iron and dust, the kind of smell that clung to the back of the throat and made everything taste faintly of smoke. The sun had been sliding down slow, setting the boards of the platform ablaze with a burnished glow, but nothing about the place felt warm to her. Clara sat on the hard bench, her lace gown crumpled beneath her, the hem streaked with brown dust where the train's wind had swept dirt up from the tracks. She kept her veil low, her head bowed, though she could feel the weight of 100 curious eyes every time a passenger walked past. They pretended not to stare, but she knew. They always did. Her suitcase sat at her feet, scuffed and heavy, the leather handle worn from her nervous grip. She had packed it carefully that morning, back when she believed she was going to be a wife, back when she still thought the world might have a place for her. Now it looked like a cruel joke, a bag filled with dreams no one wanted. Her throat ached from crying, but she couldn't seem to stop. Every few minutes another sob would rip through her chest, leaving her trembling and hollow. She tried to swallow it back, to make herself invisible, but grief didn't care about appearances. It poured from her like water from a broken jug. No one came near. The station master, an older man with a clipped mustache, pretended to busy himself with tickets. Women carrying bundles gathered their skirts and walked a little quicker past her. A group of boys laughed from the other end of the platform, their eyes darting toward her white dress, the sound sharp and unkind. Clara had thought humiliation couldn't cut any deeper than it had this morning when the telegram came. She could still see the words, burned in black ink, "Can't go through with it. Don't wait for me." Her knees had nearly buckled, but her father's hand was firm on her elbow, steadying her not out of love but out of embarrassment. "You'll leave on the afternoon train," he'd said, his voice flat, his eyes darting to the windows where neighbors already whispered. Better gone than stared at. Her mother hadn't even looked at her. By the time Clara boarded, she knew she wasn't a daughter anymore, not really. She was a problem to be sent away. The train had carried her miles from home, but the shame had followed, clinging like her gown's long veil. Now, alone at a station where she knew no one, the future stretched before her like the tracks disappearing into the horizon, endless, empty, merciless. She didn't know where to go, what to do, or how to survive. The world felt vast and strange, and she was only a broken bride with a battered suitcase and no name worth speaking. The sun dipped lower, shadows pooled beneath the benches, long fingers stretching across the platform. Her sobs quieted, not because the hurt lessened but because exhaustion dulled the edges. She rested her chin on her suitcase, eyes swollen and raw, and listened to the world move around her. A whistle blew, boots clattered, horses snorted beyond the station fence. Life carried on, indifferent to her ruin. That was when she heard them, the low rumble of voices, the easy laughter of men who had worked all day under the open sky. She lifted her head slightly. A small group of ranch hands strolled onto the platform, their hats tilted, shirts damp with sweat and dust. They looked like they belonged to the land itself, rough and steady, not broken like her. Among them walked one man who stood straighter than the rest, his stride unhurried but sure. He was tall, shoulders broad, his face bronzed by sun and wind. His hat shaded his eyes, but even from where she sat, Clara could see the sharp line of his jaw and the way he carried himself with quiet authority. Something about him made her breath catch. Not because he was handsome, though he was in a rugged sort of way, but because he looked anchored. As if nothing could shake him. She wondered, just for a fleeting second, what it would feel like to lean on someone like that. But the thought dissolved as quickly as it came. Men like him didn't notice women like her, not broken ones in torn lace with tear-streaked cheeks. Except he did notice. His laughter trailed off as his eyes fell on her. For a moment, he stopped walking, his friends continuing a few steps before turning back. He stood there, watching her with a quiet intensity that made her heart flutter in panic. She wanted to turn away, to hide, but her body felt too heavy to move. She hated herself for letting him see her like this, weak and undone. At his side skipped a small boy, maybe 7 years old, with freckles across his nose and a mop of dark hair sticking out from beneath his hat. He tugged at the man's sleeve impatiently, then followed his gaze. The boy's eyes landed on Clara, curious and unblinking. Then, without hesitation, he pointed straight at her and said, loud enough for every soul on the platform to hear. "That's my mama." The words struck the air like a gunshot. Everything went still. The ranch hands turned, startled. The station master froze mid-step. The women who had been whispering covered their mouths with their hands. Clara's breath caught, her tears forgotten for one stunned moment. Her gaze snapped to the boy, wide and bewildered. She had never seen him before in her life, yet he looked at her as if he had found something he'd been missing. Her lips parted, but no words came. She wanted to protest, to tell him he was mistaken, but her throat closed tight. Her heart thudded painfully, her mind scrambling. Why would he say that? Why her? And why, of all things, did her chest ache with something other than shame for the first time all day? The tall man blinked, startled too, then crouched beside the boy. His voice was low but carried in the hushed stillness. "Thomas," he murmured, "that's not your mama." The boy shook his head stubbornly, his eyes never leaving Clarice. "Yes, she is. She's sad like mama was. She's sitting all alone. She's my mama." The words twisted inside Clara, pulling at something deep and fragile. Tears welled again, but not from the same hollow place as before. This was different, softer, almost unbearable in its tenderness. She didn't know what the boy saw in her, why he had claimed her in front of the world, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't invisible. Someone had pointed, someone had said mine, and though it wasn't true, though it couldn't be, it warmed her like the sun breaking through storm clouds. The man, Samuel, though she didn't yet know his name, lifted his eyes to hers. For a long moment, he held her gaze, steady and searching. There was no mockery there, no pity, no sharp curiosity. Just something firm and grounded, as though he were weighing her sorrow and finding it worth noticing. He tipped his hat slightly, a small gesture of respect that made her chest tighten. Clara's lips trembled. She wanted to speak, to tell them she wasn't anybody's mother, to explain the tangled mess of her story. But all she could manage was a single broken whisper, barely audible, meant for no one and everyone at once. "Why would anyone claim me?" Her voice was drowned by the wind sweeping along the platform, but the boy's hand reached toward her anyway, open and unafraid. And in that moment, under the gaze of strangers in the setting Texas sun, Clara felt something shift, a tiny crack in the wall of despair she had built around herself. For the first time since the telegram, she let herself wonder if maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. The silence after the boy's words lingered in the air like smoke after a fire, clinging to everything, impossible to ignore. Clara's chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, her hands trembling against the handle of her suitcase. The man's eyes stayed on her, steady but not intrusive, like he was offering her a lifeline without forcing her to take it. She lowered her gaze, not sure whether she wanted to vanish into the floorboards or reach for that silent offer. She had lived her whole life believing her worth was measured by the men who chose her, or, in her case, didn't. Now here was a stranger and his child cutting through her shame with nothing but words, as if they saw something in her she couldn't. The man, Samuel, though she would only later learn his name, rose to his full height. He tipped his hat, his voice calm, measured. "Ma'am," he said, "seems like my boy's got a way of speaking what's on his heart. Forgive us if we've troubled you." He spoke not with the polite distance others used to brush her aside, but with a kind of respect that made her throat tighten. Before she could answer, Thomas tugged at his hand and insisted, "She looks just like Mama. We can't leave her here." His tone was fierce, unshakable in a way only a child's could be. Clara's lips parted, but nothing came out. Her body felt weak, her thoughts scattered. She wanted to tell them she was fine, that they should go, that she could manage. But the truth pressed heavy on her chest. She wasn't fine. She couldn't manage. She had nowhere to go, no one to wait for her at the end of the road. The words stayed locked in her throat, trapped behind pride and fear. Samuel crouched again to face his nephew. "Thomas," he said gently, "sometimes the folks we meet aren't the ones we're meant to call Mama. But we can still be kind to them." He ruffled the boy's hair, trying to soften the moment, but Thomas shook his head stubbornly, then reached out his small hand toward Clara as if to prove his point. Clara hesitated. Something in her, fragile but aching, told her not to reject the gesture. Slowly, cautiously, she reached back. Their hands touched, her trembling fingers against his small, steady ones, and something in her cracked wide open. It was Samuel who made the next move. He studied her face for a moment longer, then spoke. "If you'd like, ma'am, we can see you home. Or wherever you're headed." The way he said it, low and even, held no demand, only an open door. Clara swallowed hard. Home, she no longer had one. She wanted to laugh at the thought, but the sound would have broken her. Instead, she whispered, "I don't have a place." The admission tasted bitter on her tongue, but also freeing, like letting go of a burden she could no longer carry alone. Samuel's brow furrowed slightly. He didn't press her for details, didn't prod her wounds. He simply nodded once. "Then you'll come with us," he said, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Clara's eyes widened, startled. I couldn't," she stammered. "You don't even know me." Samuel met her gaze without flinching. "Maybe not, but Thomas sees something in you. And I reckon that's enough for now." The wagon waited just beyond the platform, its horses stamping against the dirt as twilight fell. Samuel lifted her suitcase with ease, settling it into the back before offering her a hand. Clara hesitated again, shame gnawing at her, fear of being a burden pressing down. But when Thomas tugged her skirt with a smile that was missing teeth, she found herself climbing into the wagon. The seat was hard, the air smelled of leather and hay, and yet she felt lighter than she had since morning. The road to the hard ranch wound through wide plains where the sky stretched endless in purple, stars beginning to prick through the dusk. Samuel drove with a steady hand, the reins loose but sure. Thomas leaned against Clara, head heavy on her arm as sleep tugged at him. She dared not move, afraid the boy's warmth would disappear if she shifted even an inch. Her chest ached in a new way, not from sorrow this time, but from something she couldn't yet name. The ranch came into view as lanterns flickered on the porch. A woman with silver hair stood waiting, apron dusted with flour, her expression soft as she watched them approach. Samuel helped Clara down from the wagon, introducing her simply. "Ma, this is Clara. She'll be staying a while." There was no explanation, no excuses, just fact. His mother studied Clara's gown, her tear-stained face, and instead of questions, she only reached out, touching her arm gently. "You'll be hungry," she said, her voice warm. "Come in." Inside, the air smelled of bread and wood smoke. A bowl of stew was placed before Clara before she could protest, the warmth seeping into her bones as she ate. Samuel's mother spoke little, but her kindness filled the silences where Clara's shame threatened to creep in. Later, when a blanket was laid across a bed in the small guest room, Clara sank into it and for the first time in days, sleep claimed her without struggle. Morning brought doubts again. She lingered at the edge of the porch, uncertain if she truly belonged. When she walked into town beside Samuel to fetch supplies, whispers followed, "That's the bride who was left, now she's taken in at the hard place." The words stung, but Samuel's presence beside her steadied her steps. He didn't rise to defend her, didn't need to. His silence was stronger than any argument, telling her she didn't need to answer to the world. Days passed into weeks. Clara began to help around the ranch, folding laundry, preparing meals, mending shirts with stitches that grew steadier. Thomas never stopped calling her, Mama. At first she corrected him gently, but he only grinned, unconvinced. Eventually, she stopped correcting him at all. It was easier to let the word rest between them, and secretly, she clung to it more than she dared admit. Each time he called her Mama, something fragile inside her began to mend. One night, a storm rolled across the plains, the sky splitting with thunder. The cattle panicked, breaking through a weakened fence. Samuel saddled his horse without hesitation, riding into the downpour, but Clara couldn't stay inside. Grabbing a lantern, she ran into the rain, skirts heavy with mud, shouting to guide him back toward safety. Lightning lit the sky, framing them in flashes, and for a moment Clara felt alive in a way she hadn't in years, part of something larger than herself. When the danger passed and the cattle were secure, Samuel dismounted, rain dripping from his hat brim. He looked at her with something fierce in his eyes, something that made her heart stutter. "You don't belong to the man who left you," he said quietly, almost as if he couldn't hold the words back. "You belong where you're seen. And Thomas already knows where that is." Clara's tears mingled with the rain, but they weren't the tears of humiliation she had shed at the station. They were tears of release, of finally being reminded she was more than her sorrow. She didn't answer then, she couldn't. But when Thomas climbed into her lap that night and fell asleep murmuring, "Mama," she let the word fill the silence of her heart. By summer's end, she found herself once more at the train station, the place of her deepest shame. But this time she stood with Samuel at her side, Thomas holding her hand. The whispers rose again, but Clara no longer bowed her head. She held it high, her spirit steadied, her place in the world no longer uncertain. She was not the abandoned bride anymore. She was Clara, the woman who had found a family in the most unexpected of places. And as the boy who had once pointed to her spoke again, his voice certain and full of pride. "That's my mama." She smiled through her tears, knowing it was finally true in every way that mattered.